by the mid 19th century, external world skepticism was one of the dominant schools of thought in the Anglo American philosophical world. Most philosophers at that point agreed that whether or not there is a world outside of our own minds, external objects couldn't be known. And so, more generally, we can know little to nothing except for the contents of our own minds. Enter G.E. Moore and his compatriot Bertrand Russell, who were two of the early figures in the analytic tradition. And G.E. Moore did quite a bit in his writing and in his lectures to dislodge the consensus about our inability to know the external world outside of our own minds. This piece, that is an excerpt from a larger lecture called Proof of an External World, does, according to Moore, just that. Gives us what he thinks of as a devastatingly convincing argument for the existence of a world outside of our own minds. Of course, this sort of thing you might think doesn't need to be proven. It is obvious. Everyone agrees that there are objects outside of our minds. But again, keep in mind that at the time, most philosophers were, as Moore would think of it, in the grips of skepticism. So this was quite a revolutionary proof if it was successful. What is this proof? I mean, it was delivered, keep in mind, as a lecture in the 1930s by G.E. Moore at Cambridge. Most of his colleagues were skeptics or idealists. And Moore, you can imagine, had sort of advertised this incredible revolutionary proof of the existence of an external world around campus. People came to hear his devastating lecture, ready to be convinced. And what they encountered was perhaps something a little different than what they came to expect. Here is one of the key passages of Moore's Proof of an External World. I can now give a large number of different proofs, each of which is a perfectly rigorous proof, and that at many other times I have been in a position to give many others. I can prove now, for instance, that two human hands exist. How? By holding up my two hands and saying, as I make a certain gesture with the right hand, here is one hand, and adding as I make a certain gesture with the left, and here is another. And if by doing this I've proved ipso facto the existence of external things, you will all see that I can also do it now in numbers of other ways. There is no need to multiply examples. That is G.E. Moore's famous proof of an external world. He raises one hand above his head, waves it around, says, here is one hand and here is another. There's his proof. Now keep in mind that this, although I assigned these 3 pages in which he gives this proof, the lecture itself and the article that the lecture, that is based on the lecture, is actually about 17 pages long. And this comes at the very end of this long, dry 17-page linguistic lecture on, for him, the semantics of the word soap bubble is what he focuses on for the first 14 pages or so. And so initially these skeptics are probably waiting to hear this proof, and they have to sit through all of this build-up, and then they think, finally, here we are 50 minutes in, we're going to get the proof, and this is what they get. Here is one hand, and here is another. You can imagine they were not pleased. Here's a short reconstruction of Moore's proof. Premise 1, I have 2 hands. Premise 2, if I have 2 hands, then there's an external world. Conclusion, therefore, there is an external world. This is Moore's proof of an external world. Now, is this really a proof? Or in what sense is this a proof? Well, as Moore points out later in the piece, this is valid. I mean, this is a modus ponens argument. If 1 and 2 are true, then the conclusion's true. If it's true that Moore has 2 hands, and if it's also true that having of 2 hands is sufficient for there being an external world, that is, hands are objects outside the mind, then it does follow that there's an external world. But validity is cheap, and really, of course, the interesting question, or the more philosophically interesting in this context, is are these premises true? I mentioned that Moore has about 14 pages of buildup to this proof, and really the buildup is addressing that second premise. We're not going to talk about the second premise in much detail. I'm just going to spot him the claim that if he can show that there are two hands and that he has two hands, then that's enough to show there's an external world. Just briefly, though, the reason why he spends so much time on that is that there are philosophers who he's addressing who are known as idealists who believe in objects like hands and tables and chairs, but claim that those objects are made up of mental stuff, so to speak. That really hands are objects inside the mind rather than objects outside the mind. And so he does, for that reason, find it necessary to give an argument for the claim that if he can establish that there's two hands, then they are outside objects or objects in the external world. For us, though, we've been talking about skepticism, and really this first premise should jump out to you as the one that is desperately in need of defense. Why does Moore think it's true that he has two hands? And why does he think he knows that he has two hands? And his defense of that claim is really quite simple. He says this: I knew that there was one hand in the place I indicated by combining a certain gesture with my first utterance of here, and that there was another in the different place indicated by combining a certain gesture with my second utterance of here. How absurd it would be to suggest that I did not know it, but only believed it, and that perhaps it was not the case. So here what you see is Moore giving us a defense of a certain kind of the claim, not just that he has two hands, but that he knows it. The defense is not an argument exactly. The defense instead is just an appeal to him waving his hands around. It's the demonstration. Here's one hand, here's another. Imagine him down there at the front of the lecture hall, raising his hands and waving them around in front of his skeptical colleagues and saying, here they are. Here are the two hands. What is he doing here? What's the point? Well, some subsequent readers of this piece have interpreted Moore, and I think this is pretty plausible based on his other work, as appealing directly to perceptual experience. He's saying, look, I'm having these visual experiences that represent to me, to my mind, as though there are two hand-shaped external objects. And his claim is that without any reason to doubt, without any positive proof that his senses are misleading him, it is perfectly rational and perfectly reasonable for him to claim to know on the basis of that experience that there are two hands before him. In other words, perceptual experiences sort of directly justify us in believing, unless we have counter evidence, that what they represent to us is accurate. In this case, the visual experience of hands gives Moore the best, most sort of strongest possible reasons to believe in hands. Now, you might say, okay, that's all fine, but Moore's perceptual experiences really don't support the belief that he has two hands, much less his claim to know it, unless and until he has rebutted the argument for external world skepticism. In other words, you might think, sure, there's a kind of defeasible grant of initial provisional justification to trust our senses, but it's provisional. It's not come what may. It's unless you have reason to doubt. And the skeptic has given us precisely a reason to doubt. This is the argument for skepticism that we've discussed. And the argument for skepticism, targeted at Moore's claim to know that he has hands, goes like this. If Moore knows he has hands, then he knows he's not a brain in a vat. But Moore doesn't know he's not a brain in a vat. Therefore, Moore doesn't know he has hands. And again, I mean, the skeptic is going to look at that second premise and say, Moore, how could you possibly know that you're not a brain in a vat? If you were a brain in a vat, Moore, it would seem to you as though you were giving a lecture on there being an external world. Those experiences would be exactly the same if you were a brain in a vat. So you can't claim to know that you're not a brain in a vat. And if you can't claim to know that, then you certainly don't know that you have hands. So what does Moore say about this? Because Moore does not simply dismiss the argument out of hand. I actually do think that Moore tries to grapple with it. And here's what he says in a later piece I didn't have you read, and just entitled Certainty. This comes from later in his career, in which he tries to respond to some criticisms that he received for this infamous proof of an external world. How does he deal with the skeptic's argument? He thinks he does have a good rebuttal to the skeptic. He says this: I agree, therefore, with that part of this argument which asserts that if I don't know now that I'm dreaming or that I'm not a brain in a vat, it follows that I don't know that I'm standing up or that I have hands. But this first part of the argument is a consideration which cuts both ways. I can therefore just as well argue, since I do know that I'm standing up or that I have hands, it follows that I do know that I'm not dreaming or that I'm not a brain in a vat. As my opponent can argue, since you don't know you're not dreaming, it follows that you don't know you're standing up. The one argument is just as good as the other. So Moore says, I agree with the objection that I had better have a good response to the skeptic's claim that I don't know that I have hands. They've given an argument for the claim that I don't know I have hands, and so I can't just, without replying to them, assume that my perceptual experiences justify me. But I do have a good reply to them. And the reply is that their second premise, their claim that I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, is false. This is an unsound argument, so says Moore. Why? Well, here's my argument for the claim that the second premise of the skeptic's argument is false. Here's Moore's reply, is what we'll call it. This is an argument against premise 2 of the skeptic's argument. The conclusion is, therefore, I know I'm not a brain in a vat. The first step of the argument is this: if I know I have hands, then I know I'm not a brain in a vat. That much the skeptic should agree with. I mean, recall that that is actually the first premise of the skeptic's argument. In order to know you have hands, you better know you're not a brain in a vat. Moore, though, does this little trick where he says, my second premise differs from the skeptic's. Here's my second premise: I do know I have hands. And my conclusion is, therefore, I know I'm not a brain in a vat. I want you to put these two arguments side by side and look at them and compare and contrast them. Notice that the argument for external world skepticism and Moore's reply have the very same first premise, identical. If I know I have hands, then I know I'm not a brain in a vat. Moore is essentially conceding to the skeptic the closure principle on knowledge. I had better be able to know that I'm not a brain in a vat to know I have hands. But whereas the skeptic then says, well, you don't know you're not a brain in a vat, Moore says, I know I do have hands, as his second premise. And so Moore concludes, therefore, I do know I'm not a brain in a vat, which is the denial of premise 2 of the skeptic's argument. By contrast, the skeptic says, therefore, I don't know I have hands, which is the denial of Moore's second premise. So when we put these arguments side by side, what we see is they have the same starting point, but whereas the skeptic is giving what we said was a modus tollens argument, if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P, Moore says, I'm going to do a modus ponens argument that starts if P then Q, and I'm going to add P is true and conclude therefore Q is true. This is what he means when he says, the two arguments are just as good as one another. My reply, he says, is just as powerful as the skeptic's argument, if not more. So Moore says, listen, here's how this goes. I have great reason to think I have hands. My perceptual experiences. I just wave them around. The skeptic says, nuh-uh, you can't claim to know that until you give me a good rebuttal to my argument for skepticism. Moore says, okay, great, here's my rebuttal. If I do know I have hands, then I know I'm not a brain in a vat. I do know I have hands, so I do know I'm not a brain in a vat, so your argument's unsound. Your second premise is false. Rebuttal completed. What about the skeptic's defense of the second premise, though? Because the skeptic doesn't just assert that Moore doesn't know he's not a brain in a vat. They gave an argument, and that argument was relied on this Cartesian thought that Moore, or any of us really, know that he's not a brain in a vat only if he has certain evidence that he's not a brain in a vat. And then the claim is he doesn't have certain evidence that he's not a brain in a vat. So therefore, he doesn't know that he's not a brain in a vat. what does Moore say in response to that defense of the second premise? And again, in some of Moore's later work, we get a clarification for what exactly his approach is. I think that generally speaking, Moore says, I don't know if I need to take much of a stand on exactly which of those premises is false. Maybe they're both false. He says this, though: what I can't help asking myself is this: is it in fact as certain that the skeptic's premises are true as that I do know that this is a pencil or that I have hands? I cannot help answering, it seems to me more certain that I do know that this is a pencil than that any single one of the skeptic's premises is true. Nay, more, I do not think it is rational to be as certain of the skeptic's premises as of the proposition that I know that this is a pencil. So when we look back at the skeptic's defense of the claim that Moore doesn't know he's not a brain in a vat, Moore says, I've given an argument that I do know I'm not a brain in a vat. And when I put up beside this argument, my premises are far more certain than the skeptic's premises. I mean, the skeptic's first premise is that Moore has to have certain evidence that he's not a brain in a vat in order to know it. And the skeptic's second premise is Moore doesn't have certain evidence that he's not a brain in a vat. And Moore looks at those and says, maybe one or the other of those is true, but those are both very complex, sophisticated, theoretical, philosophical claims. The first one follows from a claim about the nature of knowledge. Effectively, what it says is knowledge requires certainty. And Moore's kind of like, maybe, but why should I think that? Why don't you give me a reason? Whatever your reason is, it's going to be a reason for a theory of knowledge. But a theory of knowledge is not the sort of thing one can know, certainly not the sort of thing one can know with certainty, or at the very least, not the sort of thing one can know with as much certainty as one knows that one has hands. Or what about the second premise? My evidence isn't certain. Maybe it's not, or maybe it is. I don't know. But I don't certainly know the truth of that claim with more certainty than I know the truth of the claim that I have two hands. So what Moore is inviting us to do is compare the relative certainty we have about the existence of the external world and our knowledge of it against the comparative certainty of the truth of the skeptic's premises. And the skeptic's premises tend to be abstract philosophical claims. David Lewis, a contemporary philosopher who was very influential in epistemology and metaphysics, he passed away in the early 2000s. He, in his piece, Elusive Knowledge, toward the end of his career, he put the point this way: it is a Moorean fact that we know a lot. It is one of those things that we know better than we know the premises of any philosophical argument to the contrary. Moore says if we're going to compare common sense and philosophy, it's not that common sense can never be outweighed by philosophy, but it's that philosophical arguments have to be enormously powerful in order to overcome the rationality that common sense, such as the belief that I have hands, bestows upon its propositions. And the skeptic just hasn't met that burden. The skeptic has given an argument, but the argument relies on premises that are either unsupported or not well enough supported to outweigh the incredible justification that common sense provides. The main question that Moore faces, and the main objection, as you can already probably sense, this feels circular. It feels as though Moore's argument, Moore's proof, or perhaps his reply, or perhaps both, are begging the question. Recall that when we discussed very early on Aquinas's first cause argument, we said that that argument or a version of it may beg the question against those who deny that there's a first cause. We defined a question-begging argument as one whose premises illicitly or inappropriately assume the truth of its conclusion. And the question I want you to consider is whether Moore is begging the question. If so, where? And then a follow-up question is that a problem? We sort of assumed at the beginning of the course that all question begging is inappropriate or illicit. I think it actually is a little more complicated, and it could conceivably be that inevitably we are going to have to sometimes take certain things for granted that our opponents refuse to grant us. Maybe that's not always irrational. Maybe there are certain basic starting points in theorizing, such as there's a world outside my own mind, that I can't independently or non circularly justify, but which are perfectly rational to take for granted as starting points, nevertheless. I think that as you think about this, there are really two possible interpretations of Moore's goal. Like, what is Moore trying to do? It's entitled Proof of an External World. One reading of Moore is that he is trying to convince the skeptic. He's trying to give the skeptic an argument that they, on their own terms, can accept for the claim that there's a world outside their minds. I think that if that's what he's doing, then he is almost certainly engaged in an inappropriate kind of question begging. But it's not clear to me that Moore actually, at the end of the day, is engaged in that sort of enterprise. I think he basically thinks the skeptic is a lost cause. Instead, what he wants to do is simply demonstrate that by his own standards of rationality, he has plausible things to say in reply to the skeptic. He and Bertrand Russell, I think, both had this sense that it's time for philosophy to move on beyond skepticism. And if that requires simply planting one's flag in the ground and saying, this is my starting point, I have hands, we're going to move on now, so be it. I think that that is perhaps the more interesting practical upshot of Moore's proof, is not that he's abandoned arguments or that he thinks that it's okay to be irrational, but instead that he thinks there's more interesting philosophy to be done if we just take for granted this obvious, uncontroversial, commonsensical fact that there's a world outside of our own minds. Bertrand Russell, in one of his memoirs in the late 1950s, sums up Moore's impact on analytic philosophy and its history as follows. It was toward the end of 1898 that Moore and I rebelled against skepticism and idealism. Moore led the way, but I followed closely in his footsteps. I felt this new philosophy as a great liberation, as if I had escaped from a hothouse onto a windswept headland. I hated the stuffiness in supposing that space and time were only in my mind. I liked the starry heavens even better than the moral law. In the first exuberance of liberation, I became a naive realist and rejoiced in the thought that grass is really green, in spite of the adverse opinions of all philosophers from Locke onwards.